The accusation was already documented when Larwance Whitaker opened the folder. The $340,000 equipment he'd never touched. The manifest had his signature, but the serial number was wrong by 3 digits. Someone had rewritten the system after his delivery. The room went quiet when he asked for proof. But what came next destroyed everything. His personnel file read, audit contingent. He'd never been hired to haul equipment. He'd been hired to absorb blame. The missing unit? Not stolen. Reassigned on paper by a private equity firm testing whether contractors across 12 eastern states would notice when serial numbers didn't match, whether anyone at ground level cared enough to question paperwork that pointed at the last name on the manifest. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before careful documentation makes you dangerous to people who need someone expendable. Because Larwance is about to discover what federal testimony costs when powerful systems prefer witnesses who stay silent. They said the loss happened on his route, even though the equipment had been missing before he crossed the state line, and the way they said it, calm, procedural, like correcting a scheduling error, made it worse than shouting would have. Larwance Whitaker stood in the county logistics office near Elkton, Maryland, holding a manifest that proved he couldn't have touched the unit they were talking about. A $340,000 mobile water treatment rig that, according to the paperwork sliding across the desk, he would be personally liable for under the subcontractor insurance clause he'd signed without reading 3 weeks earlier. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made the room feel clinical, and the laminate table between them held a single folder, already open, as if the meeting had started before he arrived. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody threatened him. They didn't need to. The implication was already complete. Something expensive had vanished, and the last name on the paper was his, which meant the liability flowed downhill until it stopped at someone who couldn't afford lawyers. Larwance didn't argue, because arguing required belief that the outcome wasn't already decided, and everything about the way the supervisor from the Cecil County Depot kept glancing at the clock suggested this conversation had a predetermined length. He listened, because listening is what you do when your bank balance is thinner than your options. He had taken the job 3 weeks earlier because it ran nights and paid per mile, moving mobile water treatment rigs between storm recovery sites scattered across Cecil County, down through Wicomico, and into Sussex County, Delaware. Drive, drop, sign, leave, the kind of work no one notices until something goes wrong. And now something had gone wrong in ways he couldn't explain. What didn't make sense was how quickly the tone had shifted from routine to accusatory, how the same supervisor who'd barely looked at him during the first 2 weeks now watched him like he was holding something back. The first thing that bothered him wasn't the accusation itself. It was that the serial number they claimed was missing didn't match the serial number he'd logged outside Salisbury 2 days earlier, and the discrepancy wasn't subtle. 1 digit off wouldn't have slowed him down, but 3 digits meant the paperwork had been rewritten, which meant someone had gone back into the system and changed what was supposed to be permanent. Larwance asked a single question, his voice level, asking where the reference photo was, the one that should have been attached to every equipment transfer, and the room went quiet in a way that suggested the answer existed but wasn't meant for him. Subscribe before the paper trail leads somewhere you can't follow. He drove home to Prince George's County that morning with the accusation sitting in his chest like swallowed glass, stopped for gas near Aberdeen, and called his daughter, Kessia, from the pump because she liked to hear where he was, a habit they'd built after her mother died 2 years earlier from complications related to lupus, before the medical bills were paid off, before the life insurance made sense of anything, back when Larwance was still learning how to braid hair from YouTube tutorials. At 6 in the morning, Kessia answered on the second ring and asked if he'd be back in time to help her rehearse for a civics presentation on Saturday, the one she'd been practicing for 2 weeks, the one where she was supposed to explain how government contracts worked, how federal dollars moved through counties and contractors, how oversight failed when nobody followed the paper all the way through. He said yes, because at the time he still believed the job was only a job, and he didn't yet understand that his daughter was rehearsing the exact mechanism that was about to devour him. The job had come through a third-tier hiring platform that scraped postings from municipal procurement boards, the kind of listing that stayed visible for 3 days before algorithms buried it. Larwance had scrolled past it twice before circling back, drawn by immediate start, CDL preferred but not required, which meant they needed bodies more than credentials. The pay structure was simple. dollar per mile base, night differential, fuel reimbursement processed weekly, no benefits, no questions about the 2-year employment gap that corresponded exactly with the period between his wife Naima's diagnosis and the month he finally stopped expecting her voice when he walked through the door. He'd driven to the Cecil County staging yard on a Thursday afternoon in late August, the kind of heat that made asphalt soft and conversations brief, and signed papers on the hood of his Civic while a dispatcher with a Baltimore County accent explained the rotation. Storm-damaged municipalities across the Eastern Shore needed temporary water treatment capacity while permanent infrastructure got rebuilt or replaced, which meant mobile rigs moved on irregular schedules between sites in Maryland, Delaware, and occasionally down into Virginia when FEMA coordination required it. The routes weren't consistent enough to memorize, which was the point. Drivers received assignments 6 hours in advance through an app that calculated optimal sequencing based on variables LAR once never saw, distance and urgency, and contractual obligation compressed into a list of addresses and estimated arrival windows that updated in real time if conditions changed. The work itself required no expertise beyond basic spatial awareness and the ability to stay awake when most people were sleeping. He would arrive at a staging area, verify serial numbers against manifest data, hook the trailer to his assigned truck, usually a Ford F-350 with Delaware commercial plates, and haul the unit to wherever the app directed. Sometimes a high school parking lot in Salisbury converted to temporary command infrastructure. Sometimes a county depot outside Wilmington where night crews offloaded without conversation. Sometimes a contractor yard near Elkton where he'd drop one unit and find another already waiting. Paperwork initialed by people whose names never appeared twice. The job's appeal was its invisibility. Nobody tracked him beyond GPS pings and delivery confirmations. Nobody asked why a man with a finance degree from Morgan State was hauling municipal equipment through 3 states at 2 in the morning. Kessia understood in the way children understand when rent depends on silence. She stopped asking why he slept during the day, started heating her own dinners, learned to recognize the exhaustion that came from driving 200 miles on roads designed for 60. When he was home, he helped with algebra and listened to her practice presentations, watched her move through 8th grade with the focused determination Naima would have recognized, the same meticulous preparation before tests. On good weeks, he made parent-teacher conferences. On bad weeks, he sent apology emails that administrators marked read but never answered. The routes continued without variation for the first 2 weeks, predictable sequences of pickup and delivery that suggested someone somewhere had optimized the system to the point of invisibility. Then the tone shifted. Supervisors from different offices, one calling from a Kent County municipal building, another from a temporary logistics hub outside Norfolk, began referencing ongoing issues without naming them. The same phrase, different voices, careful and distant, as if reading from a script designed to create documentation without clarifying anything. When Lar once checked his app, he noticed completed drops were being reopened hours after he'd signed off, flagged with a yellow verification symbol, then quietly cleared by morning without explanation. Activity that looked like movement without progress, motion designed to generate a record that someone would need later. Subscribe before the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. If the job was supposed to be invisible, why was every delivery suddenly leaving a trail that someone kept rewriting? The serial number discrepancy became undeniable on a Tuesday morning when Lar once sat at his kitchen table in Bowie with 3 weeks of handwritten logs spread across the laminate surface, cross-referencing his notes against the digital records the app had saved automatically. The unit they'd accused him of losing carried serial number WT 7834 MD in the manifest he'd signed outside Salisbury on September 10th, but the equipment report from the Elkton meeting referenced WT 7831 MD, a 3-digit variance that couldn't be explained by transcription error because the numbers came from barcode scans, not human typing. Someone had gone into the system after his delivery and changed which unit was supposed to be where, which meant the accusation wasn't about a missing piece of equipment. It was about creating a paper trail that pointed at him regardless of what had actually happened. He pulled up the photos he'd started taking 2 weeks into the job, a habit formed not from suspicion, but from the same instinct that made him keep gas receipts and save confirmation emails. The image from Salisbury showed the barcode clearly, numbers legible even in the sodium vapor light of the municipal yard, and the sequence matched what he'd written in his physical log, but contradicted what the system now claimed he'd transported. The photo's metadata showed the exact timestamp and GPS coordinates, data the phone embedded automatically, which meant someone would have to argue the image was fabricated, and Larwantz knew enough about digital forensics from risk assessment work to understand that falsifying metadata required expertise most people didn't have. The routes continued, but the supervisor's language started repeating in a way that suggested coordination. A voice from the Kent County Municipal Building called on a Thursday afternoon and said there were ongoing verification issues with recent deliveries, the exact phrase another supervisor had used 3 days earlier when calling from the Norfolk Logistics Hub. Same cadence, same bureaucratic flatness, as if both had been reading from a script designed to establish concern without specifying fault. When Larwantz asked what specifically needed verification, both conversations ended the same way. A pause, then a promise that someone would follow up with details, then silence that lasted until the next vague call came from a different area code. He checked his app during a fuel stop outside Chesterton and noticed the pattern had accelerated. Deliveries he'd completed a week earlier were showing up with yellow verification flags, marked as requiring secondary confirmation, then clearing overnight without explanation or contact from anyone asking him to verify anything. The flags appeared, generated digital paperwork, then vanished, leaving a record of investigation without any actual investigation occurring, which suggested the activity existed to document concern rather than resolve it. Larwantz understood the implication. Someone was building a file that would show a pattern of problems associated with his routes, evidence that could be referenced later if they needed to justify whatever decision had already been made. Subscribe before the documentation becomes more important than the truth. He didn't panic. Panic requires belief that reaction can change outcome, and everything about the systematic nature of the discrepancies suggested planning that had started before he'd ever touched a steering wheel. Instead, he tightened his process. He began photographing every barcode from multiple angles, capturing not just the serial number but the surrounding equipment, location markers, date stamps on inspection tags. He saved screenshots of the app before and after every delivery, creating redundant records that showed what the system claimed in real time versus what it claimed hours later. He printed nothing, explained nothing, and when Kessia asked why he was spending so much time on his phone between dinner and her bedtime, he said work was complicated and left it there. The question wasn't whether the discrepancies were accidental anymore. The question was whether incompetence could be this organized, this consistent across multiple counties and communication channels, or whether someone had decided he was useful precisely because he was expendable, because blame needed a destination and he'd been hired to provide one. The personnel file arrived via email on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after Larwantz had submitted a formal records request through the company's HR portal, a feature buried so deep in the contractor dashboard that finding it required deliberate searching. The request itself had been simple. Copies of his hiring paperwork, signed contracts, any performance evaluations or incident reports, the kind of documentation any employee could theoretically access but that most never bothered to because requesting it suggested distrust. He'd phrased it neutrally, citing personal record-keeping purposes, and waited to see whether anyone would respond or whether the inquiry would vanish into the same administrative void that swallowed his questions about equipment discrepancies. The file came as a PDF, 23 pages of forms and signatures and legal language that should have been familiar because he'd supposedly read it all before signing. But the document that stopped him was page 7, a classification form he didn't remember seeing during the hiring process. His role wasn't listed as driver or logistics contractor or any of the titles the job posting had used. Instead, under employment designation, it said independent subcontractor, audit contingent, limited liability transfer. The phrase sat there in 10-point Arial, unremarkable except for what it meant. His employment wasn't contingent on performance or competence or even showing up. It was contingent on an audit that apparently hadn't happened yet, and when it did, whatever liability existed would transfer to him automatically, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because the paperwork said that's where responsibility stopped flowing. He read the section 3 times, each pass making the architecture clearer. The insurance clause he'd signed specified that equipment loss or damage during transport fell to the contractor unless systemic failure or willful negligence by the contracting entity could be demonstrated. But demonstrating systemic failure required access to records the contractor didn't have, audits the contractor wasn't authorized to request, and evidence that only existed inside systems the contractor couldn't see. It was a perfect liability trap, designed to ensure that when something went wrong, not if, but when, the blame would land on whoever held the paperwork last, regardless of cause or reality. The accusation about the missing equipment hadn't been a mistake. It had been a test. Someone wanted to see how the system worked under pressure, whether the liability structure held when actual money and actual equipment and actual discrepancies entered the equation, whether a contractor with documentation and questions would fold under procedural pressure or push back hard enough to create complications. Larwantz had been useful not because he could drive routes efficiently or manage logistics competently, but because he was traceable, because every delivery he made generated a signature and a timestamp and a GPS coordinate that could later be used to establish presence, to connect equipment to person, to ensure that when the audit came and questions needed answering, there was someone standing at the end of the paper trail who couldn't afford to disappear. Subscribe before you discover you were always the answer. He sat in his kitchen for 20 minutes after reading the file, watching the afternoon light move across the table while Kessia did homework in the next room, her pencil scratching steady rhythms against notebook paper. The discovery didn't make him angry, because anger requires surprise, and there was something almost mathematically elegant about the trap, the way every piece fit together to ensure protection flowed upward while risk accumulated at the bottom. What he felt instead was cold clarity, the understanding that the job had never been about storm recovery or municipal infrastructure. It had been about creating a record that would satisfy auditors and insurance adjusters and lawyers who would eventually need someone to blame, and he had volunteered by being desperate enough to sign forms without reading them carefully. The question wasn't whether he'd been set up anymore. The question was who had designed a system this careful, this deliberate, and whether they'd tested it on other contractors before him. Whether somewhere in Maryland or Delaware or Virginia, there were other drivers who'd taken similar jobs and faced similar accusations and quietly disappeared from the logistics network. If this was a test, someone powerful had the resources to run it. And if it was a test, they were watching to see what he would do next. He didn't quit. Quitting would have been clean, understandable, the kind of decision that made sense when someone discovers they've been set up, but it would also have been exactly what the system expected, a convenient exit that eliminated the problem by eliminating the witness. Instead, Larwantz tightened his process with the methodical precision of someone who understood that documentation was the only language that mattered when everyone else controlled the conversation. Every delivery became an exercise in creating redundancy, multiple layers of proof that couldn't be altered without someone having to commit to lying in ways that left evidence. He started photographing equipment connections with geotags enabled, capturing not just serial numbers, but the entire assembly, the way hoses connected to filtration units, inspection stickers showing last maintenance dates, mud patterns on trailer wheels that indicated where a unit had actually been. He saved receipts from way stations near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, mundane transactions that placed him at specific locations at specific times, creating a parallel timeline outside the app's digital record. When routes took him past traffic cameras along Route 50 near Annapolis or in Salisbury, he noted the locations and timestamps, understanding that those cameras kept footage for 30 days and that footage couldn't be edited as easily as a database entry. The packets he assembled were narrow by design, collections of discrepancies and questions stripped of emotion or accusation, just data arranged in ways that made patterns visible without requiring interpretation. He sent one to a procurement oversight office in Dover, a state-level desk that reviewed contractor compliance for Delaware municipal contracts, including the language about audit contingency and asking whether this classification was standard or unique to his employment. He filed a formal records request with an administrative oversight desk in Annapolis, requesting copies of all equipment transfer logs for the routes he'd driven, noting specific discrepancies between his manifests and subsequent reports. He included nothing about being targeted or set up. No narrative about billionaires or tests or systems designed to fail. just questions that bureaucrats would have to answer or officially decline to answer. Both responses generating documentation that lived in government filing systems where private companies couldn't reach. Subscribe before silence becomes the only choice that makes sense. The isolation built slowly, not through confrontation but through absence. Supervisors stopped calling. The app still assigned routes, but assignments came with less advance notice, sometimes appearing at midnight for pickups scheduled at 3 in the morning, timing that suggested someone wanted to see if inconvenience would break what direct pressure couldn't. Lar once showed up anyway, photographed everything anyway, and drove home before dawn while Kessia was still sleeping. He told her work was weird, which wasn't a lie but also wasn't the whole truth, because the whole truth required explaining that her father had become a problem for people who didn't allow problems to persist. She watched him with the same careful observation Nima had used, noticing the way he checked his phone obsessively, the way he started locking his car even when parked in their own driveway. She didn't ask questions, which meant she'd already figured out that asking would make things harder. The moral clarity came not from righteousness, but from arithmetic. Someone had built a system that required disposable people to function, that depended on most contractors being too desperate or too exhausted to notice the trap until after it closed, and Lar once had been unlucky enough to notice while still having enough energy to care. Fighting back would have been dramatic, loud, the kind of resistance that made good stories and bad outcomes. What he did instead was simpler and quieter. He kept the records, answered no questions he wasn't asked, sent his narrow packets to offices that couldn't ignore formal requests, and waited to see whether the system could survive someone who refused to disappear on schedule. The routes continued. The app kept assigning. The supervisors stayed silent. And somewhere in an office he couldn't see, someone was deciding what happens when a test subject won't cooperate by braking. The Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of October clarity that made the air feel sharp and the light feel honest, and for once Lar once was home, when he was supposed to be, sitting at the kitchen table in Bowie, while Kessia stood near the counter with note cards arranged in careful sequence, rehearsing her civics presentation. The topic was infrastructure funding and federal oversight, how money moved from Washington through state agencies to county contractors, how the chain of accountability worked in theory and failed in practice. And Lar once listened without interrupting, because interruption would break whatever small magic kept his daughter believing that systems could be understood and therefore fixed. She explained how federal dollars got allocated through competitive bidding processes that were supposed to favor transparency, but often favored companies with lawyers who knew which forms to file first, how oversight mechanisms existed on paper, but depended on auditors funded by the same budgets they were supposed to audit. How fraud happened not through dramatic theft, but through small adjustments nobody noticed until the pattern became obvious. Her presentation included a case study about a water infrastructure project in Michigan where contractors had billed for equipment they never delivered, where oversight had failed because nobody followed the paper all the way through. Lar once watched his daughter organize complexity into clear categories, watched her trace cause and effect through systems that most adults pretended not to understand, and felt something close to relief, not because her presentation solved anything, but because it demonstrated that truth could still behave predictably in small, controlled spaces, that logic still worked when you had enough distance from the problem to see its shape. She was explaining the exact mechanism that was devouring him, breaking down how contractors became convenient targets when systems needed someone to blame, and she had no idea she was describing her father's life, which meant the pattern was visible to anyone who bothered to look, which meant he wasn't crazy or paranoid, just unlucky enough to be standing where the machinery needed a body. Subscribe before you realize your daughter already knows the system that's breaking you. When she finished, he asked questions the way a civics teacher would, testing whether she understood the implications or had just memorized facts. She answered with the same precision Naima had used when explaining why experiments failed, showing her work, demonstrating causation, refusing to let correlation substitute for proof. He told her the presentation was strong, that she should slow down during delivery because rushing made her sound less confident than she was. She nodded, collected her note cards, and asked if he wanted to watch her practice the whole thing again. He said yes, because saying yes meant staying in this moment a little longer. Outside, the afternoon light started changing angles, shadows lengthening across the kitchen floor in ways that reminded him how quickly time moved when you wanted it to stop. Kessia began her presentation again, voice steady and clear, explaining how systems fail and who pays when they do. Lar once listened and understood that he was watching his daughter rehearse a truth she'd eventually have to learn applied to her own father, that innocence had a shelf life, and that this borrowed afternoon was the last one where she could study corruption as an abstract concept instead of a family problem. The calm wouldn't last. It never did. But for now, in this kitchen, with his daughter explaining how government oversight collapsed under pressure, Lar once let himself believe that understanding the mechanism might be enough to survive it. The assignments stopped populating on a Tuesday morning in late October when Lar once opened the app expecting the usual overnight batch of routes and found the schedule empty, not with a message or explanation, but with the particular blankness that suggested intentional removal. He refreshed the screen 3 times, cleared the cache, restarted his phone, and found nothing except deliberate silence. He called the dispatcher desk in Cecil County and reached a voicemail box that had been full for 3 days. He tried the Norfolk Logistics Hub and got a recorded message saying the line had been disconnected for maintenance, no timeline provided. The pattern continued through the rest of the week. No assignments, no calls, no emails except automated notifications that his login credentials were still active, which meant he hadn't been officially terminated but also hadn't been given work, existing in a bureaucratic limbo where his employment remained technically valid while being functionally meaningless. He checked his bank account daily, watching for the direct deposit that should have arrived Friday, and when it didn't come, he filed an inquiry through the contractor portal, generating an automatic confirmation number, but no human response, just acknowledgement that his question had been received and categorized as low priority. The certified letter arrived on a Monday afternoon, envelope thick with legal paper, postmarked Santa Clara County, California, return address belonging to a corporate entity Lar once didn't recognize until he looked it up. It was the headquarters of the private equity firm that had acquired the disaster logistics contracts 6 months earlier, consolidating municipal water emergency responses across 12 eastern states under one algorithmic routing system. The letter was 3 pages long, but the essential information fit in 2 sentences. His services were no longer required due to operational realignment, effective immediately, and his final compensation would be processed within 30 days pending completion of standard exit procedures that were outlined in an attached document he'd never seen and couldn't access without credentials that no longer worked. Subscribe before the system erases you without bothering to explain why. There was no accusation, no reference to missing equipment or discrepancies or investigations, no mention of the packets he'd sent to Dover and Annapolis, no acknowledgement that oversight offices had received formal questions. The letter was written in the language of corporate efficiency, clinical and distant, treating his removal as routine administrative adjustment rather than conflict resolution, which was somehow worse than being fired for cause, because at least being fired meant someone considered you important enough to justify. This was erasure without drama, the kind of termination that left no trail because there was nothing to follow, just a contractor hired through a third-tier platform and released through a certified letter that referenced policies nobody had shown him. He sat at his kitchen table reading the letter twice, 3 times, looking for the hidden message or threat or warning, and finding nothing except the profound indifference of a system that had already moved past him, that had gotten whatever data it needed and decided his continued presence created more risk than value. Kessia was at school. The house was quiet. Outside, the November light had that particular gray quality that made everything look further away, and Lar once understood that he'd been wrong about what fighting back looked like, that the system's preferred method was simpler than confrontation. It just stopped acknowledging you existed. He took temporary work 2 days later, night shifts patching shoulders along Route 50 in Queen Anne's County, the kind of labor that paid hourly and required no background beyond showing up and being willing to work in the cold. The money was less, the hours were worse, and the work left his hands smelling like tar even after he'd washed them twice. But it kept rent moving, and Kessia fed and gave him something to do while he waited to see whether disappearing was permanent or just the pause before whatever came next. He showed up to her school on time, helped with homework between shifts, and tried not to think about the question that had started keeping him awake at 2 in the morning. If the system could erase him this easily, this completely, why had it bothered testing him at all? Why does California matter? And who decided his documentation made him more dangerous than useful? The knock came after dark on a Tuesday in mid-November when the block was quiet and the cicadas had finally decided summer was over. Larwantz was helping Kessia with geometry proofs at the kitchen table when the knock interrupted them. 3 measured strikes that didn't sound like a neighbor or delivery. He looked through the window and saw the black SUV at the curb, engine off, Pennsylvania plates. A woman stood on the porch, mid-40s, business casual, holding nothing except a phone, and when he opened the door, she asked if he was Larwantz Whitaker, the person who'd logged equipment discrepancies across 3 states between August and October, the person who still had the raw files. She wore no badge and didn't ask to come inside. She introduced herself as a representative working on compliance oversight for infrastructure contracts in the Mid-Atlantic region, which told him nothing except that someone had connected his name to the packets he'd sent to Dover and Annapolis. She asked if he still had the original manifests, the photos with geotags, the receipts from the way stations near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. And when he said yes, she handed him her phone and said the call waiting wouldn't be recorded, that the person he was about to speak with needed to ask procedural questions. The voice on the other end didn't apologize or introduce itself beyond a first name, a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to without needing credentials. The questions were procedural, narrow. Where did he first notice the serial number mismatch? Who contacted him afterward? Why did he keep copies when the app stored delivery confirmations? Did anyone explicitly tell him to stop documenting? Larwantz answered plainly, listing dates and locations, explaining that nobody had told him to stop because nobody had acknowledged he'd started, that his copies existed because protection came from having proof the other side couldn't alter. The voice paused, long enough that Larwantz thought the connection had dropped, then said something that restructured the entire story, every accusation and discrepancy, and silent erasure. The missing unit hadn't disappeared. It had been reassigned on paper, deliberately rerouted through manifests designed to test whether the logistics chain could be bent without anyone at ground level objecting, whether contractors and supervisors and municipal coordinators would notice when equipment showed up in the wrong places with the wrong serial numbers, whether anyone cared enough to question the paperwork when questioning meant extra work and complications with people who controlled the contracts. Someone powerful had been watching to see who would notice and what they would do when they noticed. Subscribe before you learn your careful work exposed something much bigger than theft. Larwantz logs hadn't exposed theft. They had exposed a willingness to look away, systematic acceptance of discrepancies that suggested oversight mechanisms were decorative, present in policy documents, but absent in practice. The billionaire, his name would surface later in federal filings tied to energy infrastructure investments across multiple states, didn't offer a job or reward. He said there were federal inquiries now, that several contracts had frozen pending review, that Larwantz documentation would be referenced in testimony, without his name attached unless he chose otherwise, and then he asked a final question that carried the weight of consequence. If asked to testify under oath about what he documented, would Larwantz stick to what he could prove, even if sticking to provable facts complicated things for people who tried to protect him by pushing him out? The woman took her phone back while Larwantz was still processing what protection meant in that context, whether being fired was supposed to be mercy or strategy. She said someone would be in touch within 2 weeks, that he should keep his documentation secure, that he shouldn't discuss this conversation except with legal counsel if he chose to retain one. And then she walked back to the SUV without waiting for confirmation, leaving Larwantz standing on his porch in the November cold watching taillights disappear while his daughter called from the kitchen asking if everything was okay. He went back inside and told Kessia it was work stuff, which was true but incomplete, the kind of truth that protected her from understanding that her father had accidentally become the answer to a question powerful people had been asking. She returned to her geometry proofs, working through the logic of congruent angles, and Larwantz sat across from her, trying to focus on triangles while his mind kept circling back to the question about testimony and provable facts, and whether truth was worth the cost when the cost included making enemies of people who could erase contractors with certified letters. That night, lying awake at 2 a.m. while Kessia slept down the hall, Larwantz understood that the story had changed again, that he wasn't just a contractor who'd been set up and discarded, but a witness who documented something that mattered to people with resources and federal investigators and enough power to run compliance tests across 12 states just to see what would break. The question wasn't whether he'd been targeted anymore. The question was whether being a witness was safer than being forgotten, whether truth carried obligations that survived convenience, and whether powerful people asking careful questions was protection or the beginning of something worse. The inspectors arrived quietly over the following weeks, appearing at contractor yards in Sussex County and municipal depots in Wicomico without announcement, government sedans with federal plates that showed up at dawn and stayed through the afternoon, while men in business casual reviewed manifests and photographed equipment. Lar once heard about it through a former co-worker who still hauled for a different logistics firm, someone who'd noticed the sudden appearance of auditors and the way certain contracts had frozen mid-cycle, payments suspended pending review. Nobody mentioned Larence's name. Nobody called to thank him or update him. The investigation existed in the same space his employment had occupied, documented but invisible, consequential but distant. The courier arrived 3 weeks after the porch conversation, delivering a single-page letter on federal letterhead that confirmed his documentation had been received and cataloged, that it would be referenced in ongoing compliance reviews, that his identity would be protected unless testimony became necessary. The letter included a case number and a contact for a regional oversight coordinator in Baltimore. No compensation, no apology, no explanation of what the reviews had found or how long they would take. Just acknowledgement that his files existed in a system now, processed, and potentially useful if the investigation reached a stage where usefulness mattered. Subscribe before the truth you documented disappears into bureaucracy without your name attached. He returned to the temporary work, night shifts patching asphalt shoulders along Route 50 in Queen Anne's County, coming home at dawn with tar embedded under his fingernails in ways soap couldn't reach, the smell lingering in his jacket even after hanging it outside for 2 days. His hands shook slightly when he poured Kessia's cereal in the morning, a tremor from exhaustion and cold, and the particular toll of work that required standing on highway edges while traffic passed close enough to feel the wind displacement. The money covered rent and utilities with enough left over for groceries if they were careful, which meant Kessia learned to accept generic brands and smaller portions without complaining. Waiting became the hardest part. The investigation continued somewhere he couldn't see, moved through processes he didn't understand, generated paperwork that wouldn't include his name unless someone decided his testimony mattered more than his invisibility. He checked his email daily for updates that never came. He kept his documentation secure in a fireproof lockbox under his bed, files organized and backed up on an encrypted drive, preparation for a moment that might never arrive. Kessia asked once why he seemed distracted, and he told her he was waiting to hear about a better job, which was technically true but missed the actual weight of what he was waiting for, confirmation that doing the right thing had mattered. The validation came in pieces too small to celebrate. A news article in the Baltimore Sun about federal reviews of disaster logistics contracts. No names mentioned, no specific allegations detailed. A brief mention in a municipal budget hearing transcript where a county commissioner referenced frozen vendor payments pending federal audit. Evidence that something was happening, but nothing that connected back to him. Nothing that would let him tell Kessia that her father's careful work had exposed corruption rather than just costing him a job. By December, when the first real cold arrived and the night shifts became brutal enough that he started wearing 2 layers under his work jacket, Lar once understood that this was what justice looked like when it worked the way it was supposed to, quiet, procedural, distant from the people who triggered it, devoid of drama or recognition or the satisfaction of watching consequences arrive. He'd exposed a system that tested whether people would look away from discrepancies, and now he was watching another system process that exposure without ever acknowledging the person who'd refused to look away. The question that kept him awake wasn't whether it had been worth it. The question was whether it was over, or whether being a witness with documented proof meant the real cost was still coming. The courier arrived on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December with a formal request on Department of Justice letterhead, sealed in an envelope that required a signature Lar once provided while wearing clothes that still smelled like yesterday's asphalt. The document inside distilled down to a single requirement: His presence was requested at a federal building in Baltimore on January 7th for a preliminary deposition regarding compliance irregularities in disaster logistics contracts. His testimony voluntary, but strongly encouraged. The letter included a date, a time, a room number, and a contact for witness coordination, along with language about protections under federal whistleblower statutes that read more like disclaimers than guarantees. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket and didn't mention it to Kessia until that evening, after dinner, when she noticed the way he kept touching the pocket. She asked what was wrong, and he told her the truth in pieces, explaining that the job he'd lost had involved noticing things that didn't match up, that he'd kept records, that now people with authority wanted to ask him questions. She listened the way Naima used to listen, not interrupting, and when he finished she asked if he was scared. He said yes, not of the deposition or the questions. He was scared of what it meant to be the kind of person who noticed discrepancies and kept records instead of looking away like everyone else. Scared that teaching his daughter to pay attention meant teaching her to be visible in ways that made life harder. She nodded, satisfied with the honesty, and he understood she'd already figured out more than he'd told her. Subscribe before the choice that decides everything becomes the choice you can't unmake. The morning of January 7th arrived with the particular cold that made breath visible and metal painful to touch, and Larwan stood on the platform at New Carrollton waiting for the 8:47 mark train into Baltimore, the envelope in his jacket pocket next to his phone. Commuters moved around him with practiced efficiency, reading phones and drinking coffee, and he envied the simplicity of their morning routines, the luxury of problems that didn't make powerful people nervous. His phone buzzed against the envelope. He pulled it out and saw the number he didn't recognize, area code 650, California. Probably the voice from the porch conversation or someone connected to the federal inquiry or a lawyer representing interests that would prefer his testimony stayed narrow. The phone buzzed again. Third ring. 4 more rings, and it would go to voicemail, which was a decision but not the decision, a delay that preserved options while pushing consequences into a future that was arriving whether he answered or not. The train pulled into the station, brakes releasing that particular hydraulic hiss that marked transition points between one state and another. Doors opened. People moved. Larwan looked at the phone in his right hand, still buzzing, then at the envelope in his jacket, then at the open doors where other passengers were boarding, stepping into the train that would take them north toward Baltimore, and the federal building where rooms were numbered and depositions were scheduled and witnesses were asked to stick to what they could prove. He didn't answer yet. The phone kept ringing. The doors stayed open. The platform announcement warned that departure was imminent, and Larwan understood that whatever he did next, answer the call, board the train, walk away from both, wouldn't feel dramatic to anyone watching, wouldn't look like the moment that decided whether careful documentation mattered or whether systems absorbed witnesses the same way they absorbed everyone else who noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. But it would decide which version of the story survived, the one where he testified about what he documented, or the one where he disappeared into the same bureaucratic silence that had erased him once already, protected by distance and anonymity and the understanding that some questions were safer left unanswered. The train doors began to close. His thumb hovered over the answer button, and time, which had been moving at a pace he could track, suddenly felt like it was making decisions for him.